Sarah Martinez had always believed that marriage was built on trust. At 34, she had spent 8 years believing that her husband David was her partner in every sense of the word. Their modest two-story home in suburban Phoenix felt like a sanctuary most days, filled with the quiet rhythms of a couple who had settled into comfortable routines. David, 37, worked as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company, while Sarah taught third grade at the local elementary school. But lately, something had shifted. David had become increasingly secretive about their finances, deflecting her questions with vague responses or sudden changes of subject. Their joint savings account, which they had been building toward buying a larger home, seemed to have stagnated. Sarah noticed that David had started handling all the banking alone, claiming he wanted to take care of the financial stress so she could focus on her students. The evening light filtered through their kitchen window as Sarah prepared dinner, her mind churning with growing concerns. She had tried to access their online banking account that morning, only to discover that David had changed the password. When she called the bank, they informed her that David had requested she be removed from certain account notifications. The revelation felt like a punch to the stomach. "David," she called as she heard his car pull into the driveway. "We need to talk." He entered the kitchen looking exhausted, his usually neat brown hair disheveled, his tie loosened around his neck. There were dark circles under his hazel eyes that she hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't allowed herself to see. "Hey, babe," he said, kissing her cheek perfunctorily. "What's for dinner?" "I tried to check our savings account today," Sarah said without preamble, turning to face him fully. "I couldn't access it." "David, what's going on with our money?" She watched as his entire demeanor changed. His shoulders tensed, his jaw tightened, and something flickered across his face that she had never seen before, not just defensiveness, but something darker. Something that made her take an unconscious step backward. "Sarah, I told you, I'm handling the finances right now. You don't need to worry about it." "Don't need to worry about it?" Her voice rose slightly. "David, it's our money. Our future. I have every right to know what's happening with our savings. We were supposed to be looking at houses next month." The silence that followed was heavy and charged. David's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that she had never seen him this agitated before. In 8 years of marriage, even during their worst arguments, he had never looked at her with such barely contained hostility. "You need to drop this, Sarah," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm telling you, I've got it handled." But Sarah couldn't drop it. 8 years of partnership, of shared dreams and joint decisions, had taught her that marriage meant transparency. The password changes, the secretive phone calls, the way he had been staying late at work more frequently, it all pointed to something she couldn't ignore. "No, David. I won't drop it. This is our life, our future. If something's wrong, we face it together. That's what marriage means." What happened next would replay in Sarah's mind for months to come. David's face contorted with rage, and before she could process what was happening, his hands were on her shoulders, pushing her backward with a force that shocked her. She stumbled, her feet catching on the edge of the kitchen threshold, and suddenly she was tumbling backward down the wooden stairs that led to their basement. The world became a blur of pain and confusion as her body struck each step. Her shoulder hit first, then her hip, then her head cracked against the wooden banister. When she finally came to rest at the bottom of the stairs, crumpled against the concrete floor, the house above her was completely silent. Through the haze of pain and shock, she heard David's footsteps moving away from the top of the stairs. Not toward her. Not to help. Away. As consciousness flickered in and out, Sarah realized with crystal clarity that everything she had believed about her marriage, about the man she had loved and trusted for 8 years, had just shattered as completely as her body felt broken at the bottom of those stairs. Minutes later, or perhaps it was hours, time had lost all meaning, she heard David's voice from the top of the stairs, panicked and seemingly genuine. "Sarah! Oh my God, Sarah! What happened?" "I heard a crash." But Sarah remembered. She remembered the rage in his eyes. She remembered the deliberate force of his hands against her shoulders. And as David rushed down the stairs to help her, calling 911 with shaking fingers, Sarah realized that she was living with a man who could hurt her and then pretend to be her savior. The foundation of her world had cracked, and she wondered if it would ever be solid again. The emergency room at Phoenix General was a blur of white coats and concerned faces. Sarah sat on the examination table, her left arm in a sling, purple bruises blooming across her shoulder and ribs like dark flowers. The doctor, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, gently probed the swelling around Sarah's temple while asking questions that felt loaded with unspoken meaning. "You're lucky," Dr. Chen said, making notes on her chart. "No concussion, but you'll have quite a headache for a few days. The shoulder is badly bruised but not dislocated. These basement stairs can be treacherous, especially when you're carrying something heavy." Sarah nodded mutely, unable to meet the doctor's knowing gaze. She had told them she fell while carrying laundry down to the basement. The lie tasted bitter in her mouth, but the alternative, admitting that her husband had pushed her, felt impossible to voice. Who would believe her? David was the picture of a concerned, loving husband, holding her uninjured hand and asking the medical staff worried questions about her recovery. "I should have fixed that loose board on the top step weeks ago," David said for the third time, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine regret. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault for not maintaining the house properly." But Sarah remembered the deliberate force of his hands against her shoulders. That wasn't negligence. That was calculated violence, and the fact that he could sit here and lie so convincingly made her stomach turn. Dr. Chen's eyes lingered on Sarah's face a moment longer than necessary. "Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that if you ever need someone to talk to, we have counselors here at the hospital. Sometimes after a traumatic fall, people find it helpful to process what happened." The emphasis on traumatic fall wasn't lost on Sarah, and she realized that Dr. Chen suspected something more than a simple accident. But with David sitting right there, his hand protectively on her arm, Sarah could only nod and accept the discharge papers. The drive home was conducted in tense silence. David kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Sarah stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar streets of their neighborhood blur past, feeling like she was seeing everything through a stranger's eyes. Their house, which had always felt like a haven, now looked different. The front porch where they'd shared morning coffee looked like a stage set. The garden she'd tended so carefully seemed like something from someone else's life. Even the mailbox with the Martinez family painted in cheerful blue letters felt like a lie. When they arrived home, David transformed into the most attentive husband she'd ever seen. He helped her up the front steps with exaggerated care, settled her on the living room couch with an abundance of pillows and blankets, and brought her water, pain medication, and her favorite herbal tea without being asked. "I'm going to take the day off tomorrow," he announced, fluffing pillows behind her back. "You shouldn't be alone while you're recovering." "That's not necessary," Sarah said quietly. The thought of spending an entire day with him, pretending everything was normal, felt suffocating. "Of course it's necessary. You're my wife, and you're hurt. Taking care of you is my job." He knelt beside the couch, taking her good hand in both of his. "Sarah, I know the thing with the finances has you stressed, and I know my reaction wasn't appropriate. When you're feeling better, we'll sit down and go through everything together. I promise." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing her husband's face. The David she had married would never have put his hands on her in anger. The David she had fallen in love with would have welcomed her questions about their joint finances. This man, who looked like her husband but felt like someone she had never met, was making promises that rang hollow. "Okay," she said, because arguing required energy she didn't have, and because some instinct warned her that appearing compliant might be safer right now. That night, as David slept beside her, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling. Every muscle in her body ached, but her mind was hyper-alert, processing the seismic shift in her reality. The man sleeping next to her had pushed her down a flight of stairs, and now he was acting like her devoted caregiver. The cognitive dissonance was making her feel like she was losing her mind. Around 3 in the morning, she heard David get up. This wasn't unusual. He had always been a restless sleeper, often getting up for water or to use the bathroom. But tonight, something made Sarah track the sound of his footsteps with heightened awareness. Instead of heading to the bathroom, she heard him go downstairs to his home office. Curiosity and a growing sense of unease made her slip out of bed, despite the sharp protest from her bruised ribs. She crept to the top of the stairs, not the basement stairs, never those again, and listened intently. She could hear the soft sound of filing cabinets opening and closing, papers rustling, and then David's voice speaking in hushed, urgent tones on the phone. "I can't keep doing this," she heard him say, his voice strained with exhaustion. "The treatments are getting more expensive every month, and I don't know how much longer I can hide it from her. What if she finds out before I'm ready to tell her?" Sarah's blood ran cold. Treatments? Hide what from her? She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear more, but David's voice dropped even lower. "She caught fragments," oncologists said. "And insurance won't cover. And maybe 6 months. 6 months for what?" Her mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was David sick? Dying? Was that what he'd been hiding when she asked about their savings? After several minutes, she heard him hang up and start moving around again. Sarah quickly crept back to bed, her heart pounding so hard she was sure David would hear it when he returned. She closed her eyes and tried to regulate her breathing as she heard his footsteps on the stairs. He slipped back into bed carefully, trying not to wake her, but Sarah could feel the tension radiating from his body. He lay rigidly beside her, and she could tell from his breathing that he wasn't sleeping either. As dawn broke through their bedroom curtains, Sarah realized that her marriage wasn't just built on a foundation of trust that had cracked, it was built on a foundation of lies that went much deeper than she had ever imagined. David wasn't just hiding money from her. He was hiding something much more significant, something that involved treatments and oncologists and insurance problems. And somehow, her questions about their savings had triggered a violent reaction that suggested he would do anything to keep his secrets buried. But now Sarah had a secret too. She knew that David was hiding something medical from her, something serious enough to drain their savings and cause him to make desperate phone calls in the middle of the night. The question was, what was she going to do with that knowledge? As she lay there, her body aching from yesterday's violence, Sarah realized that the scared, trusting wife who had asked innocent questions about their savings account was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, more suspicious, and infinitely more careful. Someone who was about to discover just how deep her husband's deception really went. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. David had taken the day off as promised, moving through their morning routine with the careful attention of a nurse tending to a patient. He brought Sarah breakfast in bed, scrambled eggs and toast cut into precise triangles, orange juice in her favorite glass, and sat beside her while she ate, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "How's the pain today?" he asked, adjusting her pillows for the 3rd time. "Do you need more medication? I can call Dr. Chen if the prescription isn't strong enough." "I'm fine," Sarah said, though every movement sent sharp reminders through her shoulder and ribs. "You don't need to hover, David. It's just bruises." "Just bruises that I caused," he said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine remorse. "Sarah, I keep thinking about yesterday, about how I reacted when you asked about the savings. I don't know what came over me. The stress at work has been overwhelming, and I took it out on you in the worst possible way." Sarah studied his face, searching for any sign of the rage she had seen the night before. But David looked like her husband again, concerned, apologetic, loving. It would have been easier if he had remained the monster from yesterday. This version, the one who seemed genuinely horrified by what he had done, made her question her own memories. "What kind of stress?" she asked carefully, testing the waters. "Is everything okay at work?" The question was innocent enough, but she watched David's entire body tense. His hands, which had been gently smoothing her blanket, went still. His eyes flickered away from hers, just for a moment, but long enough for her to notice. Just the usual sales pressure, he said, but his voice had taken on that same tight quality from the night before. You know how it is, quarterly targets, difficult clients, corporate politics. But Sarah did know how it was, and David had never reacted to work stress with violence before. In 8 years of marriage, she had seen him frustrated, tired, even angry about work situations, but never violent. Never secretive. Never prone to middle-of-the-night phone calls about treatments and oncologists. Maybe I could help, she suggested, watching his reaction carefully. We could look at our budget together, see if there are areas where we could cut back to reduce the financial pressure. The change in David was immediate and frightening. His jaw clenched, his breathing became shallow, and his hands curled into fists in his lap. Sarah instinctively pressed herself back against the pillows, her body remembering yesterday's violence even as her mind tried to rationalize his reaction. I told you, Sarah, I'm handling the finances, he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more threatening than shouting. You need to stop asking about money. Every time you bring it up, you get yourself worked up, and look what happened yesterday. The implication hit her like a physical blow. He was suggesting that she was responsible for her own assault, that her questions about their joint finances had somehow forced him to push her down the stairs. David, I asked a reasonable question about our savings account, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and indignation. Married couples discuss finances. That's normal. What's normal, David said, standing up abruptly and beginning to pace beside the bed, is trusting your husband to take care of things. What's normal is not interrogating me the moment I walk through the door after a stressful day at work. Sarah watched him pace, recognizing a dangerous energy building in his movements. This was how it had started yesterday, the tension, the defensiveness, the barely contained hostility. But now she was trapped in bed, injured and vulnerable, with nowhere to run if his anger escalated again. I wasn't interrogating you, she said as calmly as she could manage. I was asking about our joint account because I couldn't access it. David, if something's wrong, if we're having financial problems, I need to know. We're supposed to be partners. David stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of frustration and something else, something that looked almost like panic. Partners, he repeated, his voice bitter. Partners don't question every decision. Partners don't demand access to every account. Partners trust each other. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah. He was talking about trust while hiding something significant enough to require treatments and drain their savings. He was demanding her blind faith while lying to her about something that involved oncologists and insurance problems. Trust goes both ways, she said, her voice stronger now despite her physical vulnerability. And right now, I don't understand why my husband is hiding our financial situation from me. The silence that followed was electric with tension. David stared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his hands opening and closing at his sides. Sarah could see him struggling with something internal, some decision or revelation that he couldn't quite bring himself to voice. Then, suddenly, his entire demeanor changed. The tension drained from his body, his shoulders sagged, and he sank into the chair beside the bed with his head in his hands. God, Sarah, what am I doing? He whispered, his voice muffled by his palms. What kind of monster have I become? The vulnerability in his voice was so unexpected, so genuine sounding, that Sarah felt her own anger falter. This was the David she remembered, the man who could admit when he was wrong, who could show remorse and seek forgiveness. David, she said softly, talk to me. Whatever's happening, we can face it together. That's what marriage is. He looked up at her then, and she saw tears in his eyes. But behind the tears, she also saw something else, a calculation, a weighing of options that made her wonder if even this moment of apparent vulnerability was another performance. I can't, he said, shaking his head. Not yet. Sarah, I need you to trust me just a little longer. I promise, when the time is right, I'll explain everything. But right now, I need you to stop asking questions. The request might have sounded reasonable to someone who hadn't been pushed down a flight of stairs for asking those very questions. But Sarah had learned something fundamental about her husband in the past 24 hours. He was capable of violence when his secrets were threatened. "Okay," she said, because she was beginning to understand that agreeing might be the only way to stay safe. "I'll try to be more patient." David smiled then, a grateful, relieved expression that transformed his face back into something familiar. He leaned over and kissed her forehead gently, his lips lingering against her skin. "Thank you," he whispered. "I love you so much, Sarah. Everything I'm doing for us." But as he left the room to make lunch, Sarah lay in bed with a new understanding of her situation. David's secrets weren't just about money or work stress. They were about something medical, something serious enough to bankrupt them and desperate enough to make him violent when questioned. And now she knew that her husband was not only capable of hurting her, but also capable of making her feel guilty for the questions that led to that violence. The scared, trusting woman who had fallen down those stairs was gone completely now. In her place was someone who understood that she was living with a dangerous man, someone who would need to be very, very careful about how she uncovered the truth. As she heard David moving around in the kitchen below, Sarah made a decision. She would stop asking direct questions. She would appear to be the compliant, trusting wife he wanted. But she would also start looking for answers on her own. The game had changed, and Sarah was finally ready to play it. 3 days later, Sarah's opportunity came in the most ordinary way possible. David had returned to work, reluctantly, after she convinced him that she was well enough to be alone. He'd spent the morning fussing over her, checking her medications, arranging everything within easy reach, and making her promise to call him if she needed anything at all. "I should really take another day off," he said for the 5th time, adjusting the throw pillows behind her back. "You're still so pale, and those bruises look worse today than they did yesterday." "I'm fine, David." "Really?" Sarah insisted, though the purple-black marks across her shoulder and ribs had indeed deepened into an abstract painting of violence. "You've already missed too much work. We can't afford for you to take more time off." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she watched David's face tighten at the mention of money. But instead of the explosive anger she'd come to expect, he simply looked away and gathered his briefcase with jerky, agitated movements. "I'll be home by 6, he said, kissing her forehead with lips that felt cold against her skin. "Keep your phone close. Call me if anything happens. Anything at all." Sarah waited 15 minutes after hearing his car pull out of the driveway before she moved. Her ribs protested as she eased herself off the couch, but adrenaline dulled the pain. She had been thinking about this moment for 3 days, planning, preparing, working up the courage to violate her husband's privacy in a way that would have been unthinkable a week ago. David's home office was on the 1st floor, tucked behind the kitchen in what had originally been designed as a breakfast nook. He'd converted it into his workspace years ago, claiming he needed somewhere quiet to handle paperwork and make business calls. Sarah had always respected his privacy, never entering without permission, never questioning the locked filing cabinets or the papers scattered across his desk. But respect was a luxury she could no longer afford. The office door was unlocked. David had probably never imagined his wife would invade his sanctuary. Sarah stepped inside, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the neighbors could hear it. The room smelled like David's cologne and coffee, familiar scents that now seemed somehow threatening. His desk was neat, almost obsessively organized. Client files were stacked in precise piles, his computer monitor angled at exactly the right height, pens arranged in a ceramic holder Sarah had given him for their first anniversary. Everything was exactly as she'd glimpsed it from the doorway on the rare occasions she'd brought him coffee or interrupted to ask about dinner plans. Sarah approached the filing cabinets first, testing the handles. The top drawer slid open easily, revealing manila folders labeled with client names and project numbers. Nothing unusual there. The second drawer contained tax documents and insurance papers, again nothing that seemed out of place. But the bottom drawer was locked. Sarah stared at the small silver lock, her mind racing. In 8 years of marriage, she had never known David to lock anything in their house. They had shared everything, passwords, bank accounts, even each other's phones when one of them couldn't find their own device. The locked drawer felt like a betrayal in itself. She tested the other filing cabinet and found the same pattern: 2 unlocked drawers full of ordinary paperwork and a bottom drawer secured with a lock. Whatever David was hiding, it was important enough to secure behind metal and mechanisms. Frustrated but not defeated, Sarah turned to his desk. The drawers opened easily, revealing the usual collection of office supplies, business cards, and scattered personal items. But in the bottom right drawer, underneath a stack of old warranty documents, her fingers found something that made her breath catch in her throat. A key. It was small and silver, exactly the type that might open a filing cabinet lock. Sarah picked it up with trembling fingers, staring at it as if it were a weapon rather than a simple piece of metal. Using this key would cross a line that she could never uncross. Once she opened those locked drawers, there would be no pretending she hadn't violated David's privacy. But David had crossed lines too. He had put his hands on her in violence. He had lied to her about their finances. He had made her afraid in her own home. Sarah inserted the key into the first filing cabinet's bottom drawer. It turned easily, the lock clicking open with a soft sound that seemed to echo through the quiet house. Sarah pulled the drawer open and found herself staring at a collection of medical files that made her stomach drop into her shoes. The letterhead at the top of the first document read Phoenix Oncology Associates. The patient name was David Martinez. The date was from 6 months ago. Sarah pulled the file out with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the medical terminology that painted a picture more devastating than anything she had imagined. Stage IIIA non-small cell lung cancer. Aggressive treatment protocol recommended. Chemotherapy regimen beginning immediately. Prognosis, guarded. The papers slipped from her numb fingers and scattered across the office floor. David had cancer. Advanced cancer. He had been fighting for his life for 6 months, and she had known nothing about it. But why hide it? Why keep something this enormous a secret from his wife? Sarah gathered the papers with trembling hands, forcing herself to read more carefully. Treatment schedule: chemotherapy every 3 weeks. Radiation therapy, daily sessions for 6 weeks. Estimated cost: $180,000 over 18 months. Insurance coverage: partial, patient responsibility approximately $85,000. $85,000. Their entire savings account, plus more. Sarah sank into David's office chair, the medical reports clutched against her chest, finally understanding the scope of her husband's deception. He hadn't been hiding financial irresponsibility or gambling debts or an affair. He had been hiding a battle for his life, one that was slowly bankrupting them and one that he had chosen to fight alone. But understanding didn't erase the violence. It didn't excuse the lies or the manipulation or the hands that had pushed her down the stairs. If anything, it made his behavior more inexplicable. Why would someone facing cancer choose to isolate themselves from the person who loved them most? Sarah returned to the drawer, looking for more answers. She found appointment schedules that coincided with his late nights at work. She found insurance correspondence detailing claim denials and payment plans. She found a notebook in David's handwriting, chronicling side effects and pain levels and fears he had never shared with her. And at the very bottom of the drawer, she found a letter that made everything clear. It was addressed to her, written in David's careful script, dated 3 weeks ago. "My dearest Sarah," it began, and even sitting alone in his office, she could hear his voice speaking the words. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're finally learning the truth I was too cowardly to tell you while I was alive." Sarah's hands shook so violently she could barely hold the paper steady. "I know you'll be angry that I hid this from you. I know you'll feel betrayed and hurt and confused about why I couldn't trust you with something so important. The truth is, I was terrified. Not of the cancer, I could face that. I was terrified of watching you sacrifice your life for mine." Tears blurred Sarah's vision, but she forced herself to keep reading. "I've seen what cancer does to families. I've watched friends' wives become full-time caregivers, giving up careers and dreams and happiness to manage medications and doctor's appointments and the slow deterioration of the person they love. I couldn't bear the thought of doing that to you. You're so young, so full of life, and I couldn't stand the idea of turning you into a nurse for a dying man. The letter continued for 2 pages, explaining his decision to handle the illness alone, his plans for her financial security after his death, his desperate hope that she would forgive him for the deception. It was the letter of a man who loved his wife so much that he was willing to lie to her to protect her from his suffering. But it was also the letter of a man who had written it 3 weeks ago, before he had pushed her down the stairs in a moment of desperate rage. Sarah sat in the quiet office, surrounded by the evidence of her husband's secret battle, and realized that she was holding more than medical records and love letters. She was holding power. David had been so desperate to keep his illness secret that he had become violent when she got too close to the truth. He had been willing to hurt her physically to protect his emotional barriers. And now she knew exactly what he was hiding, while he had no idea she had discovered his secret. For the first time since she had fallen down those stairs, Sarah felt something other than fear and confusion. She felt a cold, calculating anger that surprised her with its intensity. David had made a choice to exclude her from the most important battle of his life. He had chosen to lie, to manipulate, and ultimately to commit violence rather than trust her with the truth. Now it was her turn to make choices. Sarah carefully returned the medical files to their drawer, locked it, and replaced the key exactly where she had found it. She climbed the stairs to their bedroom, moving slowly to avoid aggravating her injuries, and sat on the edge of the bed where David had pushed her just 4 days ago. She loved her husband. Even now, even knowing what he had done, she loved the man she had married. But she also understood that love wasn't enough to excuse violence, and secrets weren't protection when they came wrapped in manipulation and assault. David would be home in 3 hours, and he would continue his performance as the concerned husband caring for his accidentally injured wife. He would bring her dinner and medication, ask about her pain, and never mention the oncologist appointments or the chemotherapy sessions or the financial devastation his secret was causing. But now Sarah had a secret too. And she was going to decide very carefully what to do with it. David arrived home that evening with Chinese takeout from Sarah's favorite restaurant and a bouquet of yellow roses, her favorite flowers. He moved through their routine with the same careful attention he'd shown since the incident, but Sarah watched him now with different eyes. She saw the slight tremor in his hands that she had previously attributed to stress. She noticed how he favored his left side when he bent to kiss her forehead. She observed the way he moved more slowly than usual, as if simple actions required careful planning. The signs had been there all along. She had just been too trusting to see them. "How was your day?" David asked, settling beside her on the couch with their dinner. "You didn't call, so I assume everything was okay?" "Quiet," Sarah said, accepting the container of sweet and sour chicken while studying his face. "I mostly slept." "How was work?" It was such an ordinary question, the kind they'd exchanged thousands of times over 8 years of marriage. But now Sarah watched David's micro-expressions, looking for tells she had never noticed before. The slight tightening around his eyes when she mentioned work. The way his jaw tensed before he answered. The practiced casualness of his response. Busy day. Lots of client calls, paperwork to catch up on. He opened his own container and began eating with mechanical precision. Jim Morrison wants to expand their equipment order for the new facility in Tucson. Could mean a significant commission if I can close it. Sarah nodded and made appropriate responses, but her mind was calculating. If David was receiving chemotherapy every 3 weeks, and his treatment schedule showed appointments on Wednesdays, then today had likely been a treatment day. He was sitting here, eating dinner and discussing client orders, just hours after having poison pumped into his veins in a fight for his life. The thought should have filled her with compassion. And part of it did, the part of her that had loved this man for 8 years, that had planned a future with him, that had dreamed of growing old together. But that compassion was complicated now by the memory of his hands on her shoulders, the terror of falling down those stairs, and the calculated way he had made her feel responsible for his violence. David, she said carefully, testing the waters, you look tired. Are you feeling okay? She watched him freeze, his chopsticks halfway to his mouth. It was barely a pause, lasting maybe 2 seconds, but Sarah saw the fear flicker across his face before he controlled his expression. Just the usual work stress, he said, the same response he'd given her for months. Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix. But Sarah had read his medical files. She knew that his chemotherapy regimen included medications that caused fatigue, nausea, and cognitive difficulties. She knew that he was supposed to be taking anti-nausea medication before meals and that his oncologist had recommended he avoid alcohol completely. Yet here he was, drinking a beer with dinner and pretending that his exhaustion was simply the result of too many client calls. The deception was so complete, so carefully maintained, that Sarah felt a new kind of anger building inside her. This wasn't just about protecting her from worry. This was about maintaining absolute control over information, even when that control required lying about every aspect of his daily experience. Maybe you should take a vacation day tomorrow, she suggested. Stay home and rest. You've been pushing yourself pretty hard lately. David's reaction was immediate and sharp. I can't take time off right now. The Morrison deal is too important, and there are 3 other clients who need proposals by the end of the week. But Sarah knew from his appointment schedule that he had another chemotherapy session scheduled for tomorrow. His agitation wasn't about missing work, it was about the fact that her suggestion had come too close to exposing his carefully constructed lie. Of course, she said mildly. I just worry about you. You don't need to worry about me, David said, his voice taking on that edge she had learned to recognize as dangerous. I'm fine. We've talked about this. They had talked about it, in the sense that David had told her to stop asking questions and she had agreed to trust him. But now she understood what trust meant in David's vocabulary, blind acceptance of whatever reality he chose to present, regardless of evidence to the contrary. Sarah finished her dinner in silence, watching her husband perform the role of a healthy man dealing with ordinary workplace stress. He was convincing, she had to give him that. If she hadn't read his medical files, hadn't seen the chemotherapy schedules and the insurance battles and the letter he'd written in preparation for his death, she might still believe his act. But she had seen those files. And now every interaction with David felt like a test of her acting ability. Could she pretend to be the naive wife who believed his lies? Could she maintain the facade of ignorant trust while processing the enormous weight of what she knew? After dinner, David settled into his usual evening routine, checking emails on his laptop while half watching a documentary about World War II. Sarah curled up beside him with a book, but she wasn't reading. She was studying him, cataloging the subtle signs of his illness that she had missed for months. The way he shifted position frequently, as if sitting still was uncomfortable. The slight yellow tinge to his skin that she had attributed to the kitchen lighting. The reading glasses he'd started wearing, claiming his eyes were tired from too much computer work, when his medical files indicated that chemotherapy could cause vision changes. How had she missed it all? How had she been so blind to her husband's suffering? But even as she felt guilty for her obliviousness, she felt angry about the choice that had been taken away from her. David had decided unilaterally that she couldn't handle the truth. He had made assumptions about her strength, her character, her capacity to support him through crisis. And when she had gotten close to discovering his lies, he had chosen violence over honesty. Sarah, David said suddenly, and she realized he was looking at her with concern. You're staring at me. Is everything okay? Sorry, she said, forcing a smile. I was just thinking about how lucky I am. It wasn't entirely a lie. Sitting there, knowing what she now knew, Sarah realized she was lucky in a terrible way. She was lucky that David's violent outburst had led her to discover his deception before it was too late. She was lucky that she now had information that could change everything between them. She was lucky that she had found his medical files before he progressed to a stage where her choices would be limited by grief and desperation. David smiled at her words, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him all evening. I'm the lucky one, he said, leaning over to kiss her temple. I don't know what I'd do without you. The irony of his statement was almost overwhelming. He didn't know what he'd do without her, but he was actively planning for a life, or death, that excluded her completely. He claimed to love her while lying to her about the most fundamental aspects of his existence. David, she said, her voice carefully neutral, if something were to happen to you, I mean, hypothetically, would I be able to access all our accounts? Do I have all the passwords and information I need? She felt him tense beside her, his entire body going rigid. When she looked at his face, she saw that familiar flash of panic that appeared whenever their conversation ventured near financial territory. Why would you ask something like that? He said, his voice tight. I was just reading an article about financial planning, Sarah lied smoothly. It mentioned that couples should make sure both partners have access to important accounts and documents. I realized I don't even know the password to our savings account anymore. David was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could practically see him weighing his options. Tell her the truth about why their savings were depleted? Continue the deception? Find some middle ground that preserved his secrets while addressing her concerns? I'll make sure you have everything you need, he said finally. But Sarah, nothing's going to happen to me. We're going to be together for a very long time. It was exactly the kind of reassurance that would have comforted her a week ago. But now, having read his medical prognosis, having seen the letter he'd written in preparation for his death, David's promises felt hollow and manipulative. Of course, she said. I'd just like to be prepared. That night, as David slept beside her, or pretended to sleep, she could never be sure anymore, Sarah lay awake processing the impossible situation she found herself in. Her husband was dying, and he had chosen to face that death without her. He was spending their life savings on treatments he couldn't afford, and he was lying to her about their financial future. He had become violent when she asked reasonable questions, and he continued to manipulate her emotions to maintain his deceptions. But he was also the man she had loved for 8 years. The man who brought her yellow roses and remembered her favorite Chinese restaurant. The man who was fighting cancer alone because he thought he was protecting her from pain. The moral complexity was staggering. David's motivations came from love, but his methods were destroying their marriage. His desire to protect her was admirable, but his willingness to use violence to maintain his lies was unforgivable. And now Sarah had to decide what to do with the knowledge she possessed. Should she confront him with what she'd discovered? Should she continue to pretend ignorance while secretly preparing for the financial and emotional devastation his lies were creating? Should she try to force him to include her in his treatment decisions? Or should she do exactly what he had done to her, maintain a secret that gave her power over their relationship? As dawn approached, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its coldness. David had chosen to fight his battle alone, excluding her from the most important crisis of their marriage. He had chosen deception over trust, manipulation over honesty, and violence over vulnerability. She would let him continue fighting alone. But she would also prepare for the consequences of his choices in ways that he couldn't imagine. If David wanted to play games with information and power, then Sarah would learn to play those games too. The innocent, trusting wife who had asked about their savings account was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, more strategic, and infinitely more careful about whom she trusted. David had created this version of her with his lies and his violence. Now he would have to live with the consequences of what he had made her become. 2 weeks after Sarah's discovery, the careful balance of lies that sustained their household began to crack. It started with a phone call that David forgot to silence, the kind of mistake that only happens when someone is juggling too many deceptions at once. Sarah was in the kitchen making lunch when David's phone rang from the living room where he'd left it charging. The ringtone was urgent, insistent, and David was upstairs in the shower. Sarah almost ignored it, respecting her husband's privacy had been ingrained in her for 8 years, but something made her walk over and glance at the screen. Phoenix Oncology Associates was displayed in bold letters, along with a phone number she recognized from the medical files hidden in David's office. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Sarah stood frozen, staring at the device as if it were a bomb that might explode. When David came downstairs 5 minutes later, hair still damp from the shower, she was sitting on the couch with a magazine in her lap, the picture of domestic tranquility. "Any calls?" he asked, picking up his phone and checking the screen. She watched his face change when he saw the missed call, watched him quickly check for a voicemail message. "No," Sarah lied smoothly. "Just me reading here." David nodded, but she could see the tension in his shoulders as he listened to what was undoubtedly a message about his treatment schedule or test results or medication adjustments. When he finished listening, he deleted the voicemail and put the phone in his pocket rather than leaving it to charge. "I need to run a few errands," he said, already reaching for his keys. "Work stuff. I'll be back in a couple of hours." Sarah knew he was going to the oncology center. She had memorized his treatment schedule from the files in his office, and today was supposed to be a consultation day. But she just smiled and nodded, playing her part in their elaborate charade. "Take your time," she said. "I might go see my sister this afternoon." It wasn't true, she had no plans to see Linda, but Sarah had learned that small lies could provide important freedoms. If David thought she was planning to be out of the house, he might be less careful about covering his tracks when he returned. After David left, Sarah found herself pacing through their house like a caged animal. The walls felt like they were closing in, decorated with 8 years of shared memories that now felt like lies. Wedding photos smiled down at her from the mantelpiece, showing a couple who had promised to share everything, in sickness and in health. David's coffee mug sat in the sink, still stained with the remnants of his morning routine, and Sarah wondered how many mornings he had sat at their kitchen table, drinking coffee and mentally preparing for chemotherapy sessions he would never tell her about. The normalcy of their life had become surreal. David continued to leave for work each morning, continued to come home with stories about clients and meetings and office politics. He brought home groceries and paid bills and mowed the lawn and maintained the facade of a healthy husband managing ordinary responsibilities. The only signs of his illness were subtle, the prescription bottles hidden in his sock drawer, the way he sometimes gripped the banister when climbing stairs, the occasional gray pallor that he explained away as tiredness. But Sarah saw everything now. She had become hyper-aware of every symptom, every sign, every carefully constructed lie. And the weight of that knowledge was crushing her. The phone call from the oncology center had shattered something fundamental in Sarah's ability to cope with their situation. For 2 weeks, she had been telling herself that she was gathering information, that she was preparing for an eventual confrontation, that she was simply being strategic about how to handle David's deception. But watching him lie to her face about the phone call, watching him manufacture another story about work errands to cover a medical appointment, forced her to confront the reality of what their marriage had become. They were living parallel lives. David was fighting cancer while pretending to be healthy. Sarah was processing his illness while pretending to be ignorant. Both of them were performing roles for each other's benefit, and neither performance was sustainable. Around 3 o'clock, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its recklessness. She drove to Phoenix Oncology Associates. She didn't have a plan. She wasn't sure what she hoped to accomplish. But the need to connect some piece of David's secret life with reality had become overwhelming. She sat in the parking lot of the medical center, watching people enter and exit the building, patients and families dealing openly with the crisis that David was managing in shadows. She saw him before he saw her. David emerged from the building looking smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical appearance. He walked slowly to his car, his movements careful and deliberate, and Sarah realized she was watching her husband in his most vulnerable state, a state he had never allowed her to witness. For a moment, she considered approaching him. She imagined getting out of her car, walking over to him, and simply being present for whatever he was experiencing. But something held her back, maybe fear, maybe anger, maybe the understanding that David had worked so hard to keep her away from this moment that inserting herself now would be a violation of boundaries he had violently established. Instead, she watched him sit in his car for several minutes, his head resting against the steering wheel, his shoulders shaking in a way that suggested he was crying. She watched her husband fall apart in the parking lot of an oncology center, alone, because he had chosen to be alone. And she felt something inside her break. Sarah drove home before David, arriving with enough time to resume her position on the living room couch with her magazine. When he walked through the door an hour later, he looked composed again, ready to perform the role of a healthy husband returning from ordinary errands. "How is your sister?" he asked, settling beside her with what seemed like genuine interest. "Fine," Sarah said, adding another lie to their collection. "How were your errands?" "Productive. Got everything taken care of." They sat together on the couch, two people who loved each other, maintaining a conversation built entirely on deceptions. Sarah wondered if this was what marriages looked like when they were dying, not dramatic confrontations or explosive arguments, but simply two people lying to each other with increasing sophistication until there was nothing real left between them. That evening, David was quieter than usual. He picked at his dinner, claiming he wasn't very hungry, and fell asleep on the couch during a movie they'd been watching together. Sarah observed the side effects of his treatment, the fatigue, the loss of appetite, the way he seemed to be struggling with nausea he couldn't acknowledge, and felt a complex mixture of compassion and fury. She wanted to take care of him. She wanted to hold him while he was sick, to drive him to appointments, to research his treatment options and advocate for his care. She wanted to be his partner in the fight for his life. But David had made that impossible. He had chosen violence over vulnerability when she got too close to his secrets. He had trained her to be afraid of asking questions, to accept his lies without challenge, to play the role of an ignorant wife who didn't notice her husband's deteriorating health. And now, watching him sleep fitfully on their couch, Sarah realized that her window for compassionate intervention was closing. Every day that David maintained his deception was another day that their marriage moved further away from honesty and trust. Every treatment session he attended alone was another step away from the partnership they had once shared. But Sarah also realized that she had her own choices to make. She could continue to pretend ignorance, enabling David's lies while protecting herself from his anger. She could confront him with what she knew, forcing a crisis that might lead to honesty or might lead to more violence. Or she could do something else entirely, something that would give her the power to protect herself while David continued his solitary battle. As she helped her unconsciously sick husband upstairs to bed, Sarah made a decision that felt both cruel and necessary. If David wanted to fight his cancer alone, she would let him. But she would also protect herself from the financial and emotional devastation his deception was creating. She would hide the cancer report she had discovered, just as David was hiding his illness from her. She would keep his secret while making plans for a future that he was trying to control through lies and manipulation. It wasn't love, exactly. But it wasn't cruelty either. It was survival. And Sarah was finally ready to prioritize her own survival over David's careful construction of lies. The war between them had begun, though only one of them knew they were fighting. 3 weeks into what Sarah had privately begun calling the Cold War, an unexpected catalyst arrived in the form of her sister Linda showing up unannounced on a Saturday morning. Sarah opened the door to find Linda standing on the porch with a concerned expression and a bag of fresh bagels from their favorite bakery downtown. "You look terrible," Linda said without preamble, pushing past Sarah into the house. "And don't try to tell me you're fine, because I got a very weird phone call from Mom yesterday." Sarah closed the door slowly, her mind racing. She hadn't spoken to their mother in 2 weeks, which was unusual but not unprecedented. "What kind of weird phone call?" "The kind where Mom said she was worried about you because you sounded distant and distracted the last time you talked, and she wanted me to check on you." Linda set the bagels on the kitchen counter and turned to study Sarah's face with the intensity of someone who had known her for 34 years. "So I'm checking. What's going on?" Sarah looked at her sister, really looked at her, and felt something crack inside her chest. Linda was 2 years younger but had always been the more direct of the two Martinez sisters. She was a pediatric nurse who dealt with life-and-death situations daily, someone who had learned to cut through emotional facades to get to the truth that mattered. "Nothing's going on," Sarah said automatically, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded hollow. "Sarah." Linda's voice was gentle but firm. "I've seen you handle difficult students, impossible parents, and budget cuts that would make a grown man cry. I've never seen you look like this." You have dark circles under your eyes, you've lost weight, and you're holding yourself like someone who's afraid of being hit. The last observation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She hadn't realized that the hypervigilance she'd developed around David was visible to others, but Linda's trained eye had picked up on the way Sarah unconsciously positioned herself near exits, the way she startled at sudden sounds, the defensive posture she'd adopted without realizing it. "Where's David?" Linda asked, looking around the unusually quiet house. "Golf," Sarah said, which was true. David had taken up Saturday morning golf recently, claiming he needed the exercise and fresh air. Sarah now knew that he was probably struggling with the physical demands of his treatment and had been advised to maintain moderate activity, but she let him maintain the fiction that it was simply a new hobby. "Good," Linda said, settling onto the couch and patting the cushion beside her. "Sit down and tell me what's really happening." For a moment, Sarah considered maintaining the lies. She had become so practiced at deception over the past month that spinning another story for Linda would have been easy. But sitting in her living room, looking at her sister's genuinely concerned face, Sarah felt exhausted by the weight of secrets she was carrying. "David and I are having problems," she said carefully, testing the waters. "What kind of problems? Financial? Marital? Health?" The last word made Sarah flinch involuntarily, and Linda's eyes sharpened with professional concern. "Sarah, are you okay? Physically, I mean. Have you been hurt?" And suddenly, without planning to, Sarah was rolling up her sleeve to show Linda the faded yellow-green bruises that still marked her shoulder and arm. The marks from her fall down the stairs had healed significantly, but they were still visible to someone who knew what to look for. Linda's intake of breath was sharp and immediate. "Jesus, Sarah. What happened?" "I fell down the basement stairs," Sarah said, the lie coming automatically even though she had decided to tell Linda the truth. But Linda was a nurse who had worked in emergency departments before specializing in pediatrics. She had seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the pattern of bruising that came from human hands rather than accidental falls. "Sarah," she said very quietly, "those bruises on your upper arms look like finger marks. Did someone grab you?" The gentleness in Linda's voice, combined with the professional certainty of her observation, broke through the last of Sarah's defenses. She found herself crying for the first time since the incident, months of suppressed fear and confusion and betrayal pouring out in shuddering sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. Linda moved closer and wrapped her arms around Sarah, not asking questions, not demanding explanations, just providing the kind of unconditional support that Sarah had been desperately needing without realizing it. "He pushed me," Sarah whispered into Linda's shoulder. "I asked him about our savings account, and he got angry, and he pushed me down the stairs." Linda's arms tightened around her, but her voice remained calm and controlled. "Are you safe now? Has he hurt you since then?" "No." "Yes. I mean, he hasn't hit me again, but I don't feel safe. He's been different since it happened. More controlling, more secretive. And there are things he's not telling me." Sarah pulled back from Linda's embrace, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know what to do. I love him, but I don't trust him anymore. And I'm scared of what will happen if I push too hard for answers." Linda was quiet for a moment, processing the information with the kind of methodical thinking that made her excellent at her job. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think David is using drugs? Or gambling? Something that would explain the financial secrecy and the personality changes?" Sarah almost laughed at the irony of the question. If only it were something as straightforward as addiction or gambling. "No. It's not drugs or gambling. It's..." She hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "It's medical." "Medical how? Is David sick?" The direct question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized she had reached a crossroads. She could continue to protect David's secret, maintaining his lie while seeking support for her own emotional trauma. Or she could tell Linda the truth and finally have someone to share the impossible burden of knowledge she'd been carrying alone. David has cancer, Sarah said, the words feeling strange and heavy in her mouth. Advanced lung cancer. He's been getting treatment for months, and he never told me. I only found out by accident, and he doesn't know that I know. Linda stared at her sister with an expression of complete bewilderment. He has cancer and he didn't tell you? Sarah, that doesn't make any sense. Why would someone hide a cancer diagnosis from their spouse? Because he's trying to protect me, Sarah said, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. He wrote this letter explaining how he didn't want me to become his caregiver, how he wanted to shield me from watching him deteriorate. Very noble, very loving, very stupid. And very controlling, Linda added grimly. Sarah, that's not protection. That's manipulation. He's making unilateral decisions about your life, your marriage, your future, without giving you any input. And when you got too close to the truth, he became violent. Hearing Linda articulate what Sarah had been feeling but couldn't quite express was both validating and terrifying. But his motivations aren't malicious, Sarah said, testing her own thoughts. He really thinks he's protecting me. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Linda said firmly. And protection that requires violence and lies isn't protection at all. It's control. They sat in silence for several minutes, Sarah processing the relief of finally sharing her burden while Linda worked through the implications of what she'd learned. What are you going to do? Linda asked finally. I don't know, Sarah admitted. I've been hiding the fact that I know, just like he's been hiding the cancer from me. We're both living these elaborate lies, and I don't see how it ends without someone getting hurt worse than they already have been. Linda leaned forward, taking Sarah's hands in hers. Sarah, I want you to listen to me very carefully. David's cancer diagnosis doesn't excuse domestic violence. I don't care how scared he is, how sick he is, or how noble he thinks his motivations are. The moment he put his hands on you in anger, this became about more than medical privacy. This became about your safety. I know, Sarah said quietly. I do know that. But it's complicated because I love him, and he's dying, and part of me wants to fight for him even though he won't let me. Love doesn't mean accepting abuse, Linda said gently. And you can't save someone who won't admit they need saving. David has made choices, to lie to you, to exclude you, to respond with violence when challenged. Those are his choices, and you're not responsible for fixing them. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of guilt she hadn't realized she was carrying. For weeks, she had been wrestling with how to respond to David's deception, feeling torn between compassion for his illness and anger about his methods. Linda's perspective helped clarify something important. David's cancer didn't obligate Sarah to accept his lies or his violence. So what do I do? Sarah asked. First, you keep yourself safe, Linda said firmly. If David becomes violent again, you leave immediately. Do you have somewhere you can go? Sarah nodded. I could stay with you, or with Mom and Dad. Good. Second, you decide whether you want to try to save this marriage or whether you want to protect yourself from further damage. Both are valid choices, but you need to be clear about which path you're choosing. And third? Sarah asked. Linda smiled grimly. Third, you stop letting David control all the information. If he wants to keep secrets, fine. But you don't have to participate in his deception anymore. You can make your own choices based on what you know, not on what he's willing to tell you. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something like hope. Linda was right, she didn't have to choose between ignorant trust and compassionate martyrdom. She could acknowledge David's illness while still protecting herself from his deception and potential violence. I need to think about all of this, Sarah said. Of course you do. But Sarah, promise me you won't think about it alone anymore. This is too big for one person to handle, especially when that person is dealing with the trauma of domestic violence. Sarah promised, and for the first time since she'd fallen down those basement stairs, she felt like she wasn't drowning. Linda's visit had thrown her a lifeline, not a solution, but perspective and support that made solutions feel possible. When David returned from golf that afternoon, he found Sarah in the kitchen preparing lunch with what seemed like renewed energy. She smiled at him, asked about his game, and listened to his stories about missed putts and challenging holes. But something fundamental had changed. Sarah was no longer carrying her burdens alone, and David's carefully constructed performance no longer had the power to make her doubt her own perceptions. The path to healing wasn't about saving her marriage or enabling David's deception. It was about reclaiming her own agency and making decisions based on truth rather than manipulation. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like herself again. The confrontation came, as most life-changing moments do, when Sarah least expected it. It was a Tuesday evening in early November, exactly 6 weeks after she had discovered David's medical files, and the autumn air carried the promise of winter in its chill. David had just returned from what he claimed was a late meeting with a potential client, but Sarah knew from his treatment schedule that he'd actually been at Phoenix Oncology Associates for his latest round of chemotherapy. He looked terrible. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that no amount of foundation could hide, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was betraying him in fundamental ways. But when Sarah asked how his meeting had gone, David manufactured another elaborate story about contract negotiations and delivery schedules, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that lined his face. Sarah watched him perform this fiction with a mixture of admiration and revulsion. Even while fighting for his life, even while poison coursed through his veins in an attempt to kill the cancer that was killing him, David maintained his commitment to the lie that was slowly destroying their marriage. "David," she said quietly, "how long are you planning to keep this up?" He was hanging his coat in the front closet, and she saw his hands still on the hanger. "Keep what up?" "The lies. The pretending. The elaborate stories about clients and meetings and work stress." David turned to face her, and she saw something shift in his expression, a wariness that suggested he knew they were entering dangerous territory. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah walked to the kitchen table and sat down, folding her hands in front of her with deliberate calm. "David, I need you to sit down. We need to have a conversation that's been 6 weeks overdue." "Sarah, I'm tired. Can we do this tomorrow?" "No." The firmness in her own voice surprised her. "We can't do this tomorrow, because tomorrow you'll manufacture another excuse, another delay, another lie to avoid having this conversation. Sit down." David remained standing, his body language defensive and increasingly agitated. "Sarah, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but I don't appreciate the interrogation every time I walk through the door." "Interrogation?" Sarah's voice rose slightly. "David, I haven't asked you a real question in 6 weeks. I've been the perfect, compliant wife who accepts whatever story you choose to tell me. But I can't do it anymore." "Can't do what anymore?" "Pretend that I don't know you have cancer." The words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. Sarah watched David's face cycle through a series of expressions: shock, denial, fear, and finally, anger. "That's ridiculous," he said, but his voice was shaking. "I don't have cancer." "Where would you get an idea like that?" "From your medical files," Sarah said calmly. "From the appointment schedules hidden in your locked filing cabinet. From the prescription bottles in your sock drawer. From the letter you wrote to me explaining why you chose to fight your illness alone." David's face went white, then red, then white again. She could see him calculating, trying to determine how much she knew and how long she'd known it. "You went through my private papers," he said, and she could hear the rage building in his voice. "You violated my privacy. You changed our banking passwords and excluded me from our financial decisions," Sarah replied evenly. "You lied to me about our savings, about your health, about virtually every aspect of your daily life for months. Let's talk about violations of privacy and trust." David began pacing around the kitchen, his movements sharp and agitated. Sarah recognized the signs: the clenched fists, the rapid breathing, the barely contained hostility that had preceded his violence 6 weeks ago. But this time, she was prepared. "You had no right," David said, his voice getting louder. "Those files are private. My medical information is private. You had no right to go through my things." "I had every right," Sarah said, standing up to face him. "I'm your wife, David." "Your wife? We're supposed to share our lives, including the difficult parts. Especially the difficult parts." "You wouldn't understand," David said, stopping his pacing to glare at her. "You couldn't handle it. I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Sarah's voice was incredulous. "You were protecting me by lying to me every single day? By draining our savings for treatments you never mentioned? By making me think I was going crazy when I noticed changes in your behavior? I was protecting you from having to watch me die." David shouted, his control finally snapping. "I was protecting you from becoming a nursemaid to a dying man. I was protecting you from sacrificing your life for mine." The admission hung between them, raw and honest and devastating. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "That wasn't your choice to make," Sarah said finally, her voice steady despite the tears she could feel building behind her eyes. "You don't get to decide unilaterally what I can handle or what sacrifices I'm willing to make. You don't get to choose what kind of wife I am or how I respond to crisis." "I know you," David said desperately. "I know you would have dropped everything to take care of me. You would have given up your career, your friends, your whole life to manage my medications and appointments and treatments. I couldn't let you do that. So instead you decided to let me live a lie," Sarah said. "You decided that I should go through our daily routines believing everything was normal while you fought for your life in secret. You decided that I should plan for a future that you knew we might not have." David's anger seemed to deflate suddenly, leaving him looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "I thought I could beat it," he said quietly. "I thought I could get through the treatments and into remission without you ever having to know. I thought I could protect both of us from this nightmare. And when I got too close to the truth, you pushed me down the stairs," Sarah said, her voice hard. David flinched as if she had slapped him. "That was... I didn't mean... Sarah, I was terrified that you were going to discover everything before I was ready. I panicked." "You became violent," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference between panic and assault, David. You put your hands on me in anger and pushed me down a flight of stairs." "I know," David whispered. "God, Sarah, I know. I've been sick about it every day since it happened. I never thought I was capable of hurting you like that." "But you were capable of it," Sarah said. "And you did it. And then you spent weeks making me feel like the problem was my questions, not your lies or your violence." They stared at each other across their kitchen, two people who had loved each other for 8 years but who had become strangers through deception and fear and misguided attempts at protection. "What happens now?" David asked finally. Sarah had been preparing for this question for weeks, ever since her conversation with Linda had helped her understand that she had choices beyond accepting David's deception or abandoning him completely. "Now you tell me the truth," she said. "All of it. Your diagnosis, your prognosis, your treatment plan, our financial situation, everything. No more lies, no more protection, no more decisions made without me." David nodded slowly. "And then?" "And then we figure out whether there's still a marriage left to save," Sarah said. "David, I love you. I have loved you for 8 years, and I want to support you through this illness. But I will not be lied to, manipulated, or threatened ever again. If you want me as your partner in this fight, then I need to be your actual partner. That means honesty, even when it's difficult. It means including me in decisions about our life together. And it means never, ever putting your hands on me in anger again." "What if I can't promise that?" David asked, and Sarah appreciated the honesty of the question even as it terrified her. "Then I'll leave," she said simply. I'll support you through your treatment as a friend, but I won't stay married to someone who sees violence as an acceptable response to stress or conflict. David was quiet for a long moment, processing the ultimatum that wasn't really an ultimatum but rather a clear statement of boundaries and expectations. I want to try, he said finally. Sarah, I want to be honest with you. I want you to be my partner in this. I'm scared, and I'm sick, and I don't know how to do any of this without the lies I've been hiding behind. We'll figure it out together, Sarah said. But David, this is your last chance. If you lie to me again, if you exclude me from important decisions, if you ever touch me in anger again, I'm done. Do you understand? I understand, David said, and for the first time in months, Sarah believed him. The confrontation she had been dreading for weeks was over, and both of them were still standing. It wasn't a happy ending. There was too much damage, too much broken trust, too much uncertainty about David's health and their future. But it was a beginning. For the first time since she had fallen down those basement stairs, Sarah felt like she and David were on the same side of their problems rather than on opposite sides of an elaborate deception. It was a start. The weeks following their confrontation were unlike anything Sarah had experienced in 8 years of marriage. It was as if she and David were learning how to be married all over again, this time with the foundation of brutal honesty that had been missing from their relationship for months. David kept his promise to tell her everything. The morning after their kitchen confrontation, he sat at their dining room table with a stack of medical files and financial documents, walking her through his diagnosis, treatment plan, and the devastating impact on their savings with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had been carrying secrets for too long. Stage IIIA non-small cell lung cancer, he said, his voice clinical and detached as he read from his oncologist's notes. Discovered during a routine chest X-ray in April. I'd been having this persistent cough, and Dr. Peterson thought it might be bronchitis or allergies. Sarah listened, taking notes in a small notebook she'd bought specifically for this purpose. After months of being excluded from the most important crisis in their shared life, she was determined to understand every detail, every decision, every factor that would influence their future. The tumor was too advanced for surgery, David continued, so Dr. Ramirez, my oncologist, recommended aggressive chemotherapy followed by radiation. The goal is remission, but even in the best-case scenario, we're looking at years of ongoing treatment and monitoring. What's the worst-case scenario? Sarah asked, her pen poised over her notebook. David was quiet for a moment, staring at the medical reports spread across their table. 18 months to 2 years if the current treatment protocol doesn't work. Less if the cancer spreads to other organs. The numbers hit Sarah like physical blows, but she forced herself to keep writing. This was what David had been carrying alone, not just the physical battle against cancer, but the emotional weight of mortality timelines and worst-case scenarios. The treatments cost about $15,000 per month, David said, moving to the financial documents. Our insurance covers about 60%, which leaves us responsible for roughly $6,000 monthly, plus additional costs for medications, scans, and specialist consultations. Sarah looked at the spreadsheet David had created, tracking their savings depletion month by month. Their joint account, which had contained $45,000 in April, was down to $12,000. Their retirement funds had been significantly reduced. David had even taken a second mortgage on their house to cover treatment costs. Why didn't you tell me we were going into debt? Sarah asked. I could have picked up extra tutoring, or we could have looked into financial assistance programs, or... Their house, when they returned to it, looked exactly the same as it had 15 months ago. But everything felt different. The basement stairs that had once been a symbol of violence were now just stairs. The home office where David had hidden his secrets was now a space they shared, with Sarah's teaching materials mingled with David's work files. That evening, they sat together on their couch, the same couch where Sarah had recovered from her injuries, where David had performed his careful charade of the concerned husband, where they had slowly learned to trust each other again. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had never found your medical files? Sarah asked. David considered the question seriously. I think I would have died, he said simply. Not from the cancer, the treatment was working even then. But I would have died from the isolation, from carrying everything alone. I was drowning in secrets, and I didn't even realize it. I was drowning too, Sarah admitted. In confusion and fear and the feeling that I was losing my mind. Finding out about the cancer was terrifying, but at least it made sense of everything else. They were quiet for a moment, both processing the alternative timeline where David's deception had continued until his death, leaving Sarah to discover the truth only through insurance claims and medical bills. Sarah, David said softly, I need you to know that remission doesn't mean we're done dealing with this. There will be ongoing scans and monitoring and the constant possibility that the cancer could return. Are you prepared for that uncertainty? It was exactly the kind of honest, difficult conversation that the old David would have avoided to protect her from worry. But they had learned that protection through deception was just another form of harm. I'm prepared to face whatever comes next, Sarah said. Together. With honesty. That's all I've ever wanted. David kissed her then, gently and carefully, and Sarah tasted salt from tears she hadn't realized she was crying. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope, and of the deep, complicated love that had somehow survived the worst either of them had ever experienced. Outside their window, the sun was setting over the mountains that surrounded Phoenix, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossibly beautiful. Inside their house, two people who had nearly lost each other to secrets and fear were learning to love each other with the kind of honesty that made everything else possible. They had fallen down the stairs together, metaphorically and literally. But they had also learned to climb back up, step by careful step, building something stronger than what they had lost. The cancer report that Sarah had once hidden in anger and self-protection now sat in a shared filing system, along with treatment records and insurance documents and the correspondence they wrote together to the various medical and financial institutions that had become part of their life. The secrets were gone. The lies were over. What remained was the kind of love that could survive the worst and still choose to hope for the best. And as they sat together in their living room, holding hands and watching the sunset, Sarah realized that this was what healing looked like, not the erasure of trauma, but the choice to build something beautiful on top of the wreckage. They were different people than they had been 15 months ago. Their marriage was different too. But different didn't mean broken. Different meant stronger, more honest, more real. Different meant they had learned to love each other with their eyes wide open, and that made all the difference in the world.